There is a barn on a section of land off County Road 9 in McLeod County, Minnesota, where a 1967 Minneapolis-Moline G1000 has not turned its engine over in more than 30 years. The paint is still Prairie Gold, that deep, sun-baked amber that the company mixed specifically to catch the light of a Minnesota morning coming low across a harvested field. The company that built that tractor stopped building tractors in 1974 when White Motor Corporation discontinued the Minneapolis-Moline name and folded what remained into its White Farm Equipment division. The barn is still there. The tractor is still there. The company is not. Minneapolis-Moline did not begin as a single company. It was born from the convergence of three separate manufacturing firms, each of which had already spent decades earning the trust of Midwest farmers. The first was the Minneapolis Steel and Machinery Company, founded in 1902 on the banks of the Mississippi in Minneapolis, Minnesota, selling threshing machines under the Twin City brand across the Dakotas and Minnesota. The second was the Minneapolis Threshing Machine Company, incorporated in 1887 in Hopkins, Minnesota. The third was the Moline Implement Company of Moline, Illinois, founded in 1852 along the Rock River. The merger that created Minneapolis-Moline Power Implement Company was consummated in 1929, just months before the stock market collapsed. What they built in their first decade, and what announced them to the industry, was the 1938 UDLX Comfort Tractor, an enclosed cab tractor with a heater, a radio, a passenger seat, and 40-mile-per-hour road speed. The tractor you can drive to church. Minneapolis-Moline sold approximately 150 UDLX units before the price, $2,155 new, roughly $46,000 today, made further sales impossible. The Comfort Tractor was discontinued after a single model year, but the ambition had announced something. This was a company that thought about what a farmer's life felt like inside the cab. What happened next was the decision that every dealer in the Corn Belt had feared for a decade, and it arrived exactly as they had feared it would. Minneapolis-Moline was about to build the tractor that would make them untouchable. The question haunting every dealer who watched it roll off the line was whether any company could stay untouchable for long. Every brand has one tractor that represents its peak. For Minneapolis-Moline, that tractor is the G1000. Introduced in 1965, the G1000 was built at the Hopkins, Minnesota plant on the original Minneapolis Threshing Machine Company site. A 504 cubic inch, 6-cylinder diesel producing 101 horsepower at the PTO, among the most powerful row crop tractors in production anywhere in the United States that year. A farmer named Dwayne Schreiber of Yellow Medicine County, Minnesota, who purchased a G1000 in 1967 and operated it for 18 years, described the experience in a 1983 issue of Prairie Farmer. It never gave me a day's trouble I couldn't fix myself. The engine was honest. When it pulled clean. I ran it 14, sometimes 16 hours a day in the fall, and it came back the next morning like it had slept. Minneapolis-Moline entered the 1960s as a genuinely competitive force, but what it could not outrun was size. John Deere and International Harvester held diversified industrial revenues that could subsidize lean years. Minneapolis-Moline made tractors and implements. That was all it made. The acquisition came in 1963 when White Motor Corporation, a Cleveland, Ohio truck manufacturer with no prior history in farm tractors, purchased Minneapolis-Moline for $10 million. White had already acquired Oliver in 1960 and Cockshut of Canada in 1962. Three mid-sized brands combined, it turned out, did not equal one large brand. By the late 1960s, White was painting the same tractors in different colors and selling them under three names. The G1050 of 1969 was mechanically similar to the Oliver 1955 sold the same year. The dealers knew it, the farmers figured it out. And when farmers figure out they are being sold a rebranded machine, the brand that sold it to them loses something it rarely recovers. There is a balance sheet in the White Motor Corporation archive that shows the precise moment when Minneapolis-Moline's independence became impossible to sustain. The date on that document is not what most people believe. The brand did not die in 1974 when the name was retired. It died a decade earlier in the boardrooms of Minneapolis when the numbers stopped adding up. Between 1981 and 1986, more than 300,000 American farms were foreclosed. Commodity prices collapsed. Corn that had sold for $3.65 a bushel in 1980 fell below $2 by 1986. Interest rates peaked at 21% in 1981. Equipment orders fell off the books of every dealer in the Corn Belt in a single season. The final auction of the Hopkins, Minnesota plant equipment took 11 hours to complete. Tooling that had built more than 1 million tractors across 7 decades was sold for scrap prices. The auctioneer later said he had never worked a room so quiet. These were not strangers looking at anonymous industrial assets. These were men who had worked those machines, or whose fathers had. At its peak in the early 1960s, the Minneapolis-Moline plant in Hopkins, Hennepin County, employed more than 2,000 workers, machinists, foundry workers, assembly line operators, engineers who had followed their fathers and grandfathers into the same buildings. Hopkins had grown up around the factory. Its population in 1960 was just over 10,000, and a significant portion of the working adults in that town drew a check from the plant on Hopkins Street. By 1980, when White Farm Equipment finally ceased operations at the facility, the workforce had been reduced to fewer than 400. The original brick foundry building, dating to the Minneapolis Threshing Machine Company era, was demolished in 1993. The rail spur that once carried finished tractors to implement dealers across the upper Midwest was torn up in 1985 and converted to a recreational trail. Hopkins today has a population of approximately 18,000 and has evolved into a dense inner-ring suburb of the Twin Cities. You can get very good coffee in Hopkins. You can find nothing in Hopkins that remembers what was. Somewhere tonight, in a machinery shed in Renville County, Minnesota, a 1963 Minneapolis-Moline G1000 Vista is having its fuel injection pump rebuilt for the show season. The man doing the work is in his late 60s. He learned the injection system from his father, who bought the tractor new in 1964 from the Winthrop implement dealer and ran it on 480 acres of corn and soybeans for 22 years. The company that built it no longer exists in any meaningful form. The knowledge of how to run it lives only in people and in machines that refuse to stop working. The Minneapolis-Moline Collectors Association, founded in 1973, the year before the name was officially retired, has maintained a continuous membership and annual show schedule for more than 5 decades. The annual Rolog Western Minnesota Steam Threshers Reunion, held each Labor Day weekend near Rolog, Minnesota, is perhaps the single largest gathering of Minneapolis-Moline iron in the world. Of the original UDLX comfort tractors, approximately 120 are believed to survive. An unrestored G1000 in original Prairie Gold commands a premium over a restored example in some collector circles, because the original paint carries a history that a reproduction color cannot replicate. The Prairie Gold of a Minneapolis-Moline did not disappear from the landscape by accident. It disappeared because the farms that ran them disappeared, or changed beyond recognition. The 480-acre corn and soybean operation in Renville County that once justified a G1000 either grew to 2,000 acres and bought a John Deere 8630, or it didn't survive the 1980s at all. The machine and the scale of farming it was designed to serve went out of the world together. Minneapolis-Moline was a company that, at its best, understood what it meant to think about the farmer inside the cab. The UDLX was not a commercially viable product. It was a statement of values, that the person running the machine deserved comfort, deserved a heater, deserved a radio, deserved the dignity of arriving in town without being coated in field dust. That instinct was right. It was simply 40 years ahead of the market that would eventually reward it. By the time enclosed cabs and climate control became standard on American tractors in the 1970s, the company that had first imagined them was already gone. The idea survived. The company did not. That is perhaps the most Minneapolis-Moline ending imaginable. The G1000 in that McLeod County barn has not moved in 30 years. The paint is still Prairie Gold, or close enough to it that October light still finds it across the yard in the way somebody, decades ago, believed it should.
There is a particular kind of silence that settles over a machinery shed in the weeks after harvest. Not the silence of emptiness, but the silence of rest. Tools return to their hooks, oil checked and topped. The tractor pulled in from the field for the last time that season and left to sit in the dark until spring makes its first demands again. In hundreds of sheds across the upper Midwest tonight, that tractor is a Minneapolis-Moline. Not because anyone planned it that way, not because a dealer recommended it or a manufacturer still supports it with parts and service bulletins, but because it was there when the farmer's father put it in the shed 40 years ago, and it still works. And in farming, a machine that still works is not replaced until the cost of keeping it running exceeds the cost of what it does.
That calculation, the pure, unsentimental arithmetic of the working farm, is, in its way, the greatest compliment a tractor can receive. Not the show ring, not the restored paint and the polished manifold and the trophy at the county fairgrounds, but the shed, the oil on the floor, the bale of twine sitting on the fender because there was nowhere else to put it, the machine that is still in the rotation because it has not yet given anyone a reason to remove it. Minneapolis-Moline built machines that passed that test on farms across the northern grain belt for decades after the company itself ceased to exist. That is a form of engineering integrity that no corporate acquisition can fully erase.
Before a tractor brand disappears from the fields, it disappears from the dealer lots. This is the sequence that most histories of fallen equipment companies get wrong. They focus on the factory, the corporate boardroom, the final tractor off the line. But the death of a brand in agriculture happens first at the implement dealer, the man on the county road with the parts inventory and the service bays and the loan arrangement with the local bank that let a farmer carry a new machine through a bad year. The Minneapolis-Moline dealer network at its peak in the late 1950s ran to more than 2,500 outlets across the United States and Canada. These were not chain stores. They were family businesses, father-to-son operations in towns of 2,000 people, where the implement dealer was as central to the agricultural economy as the elevator or the co-op. A man named Arvid Lundin ran the Minneapolis-Moline dealership in Willmar, Minnesota from 1951 until 1971, when the white consolidation made it no longer possible to stock a full line alongside the white-branded machines that were slowly replacing it. He switched to a competing line. He later said in a recorded oral history held by the Kandiyohi County Historical Society that the decision cost him 3 customers he had never expected to lose, men whose fathers had bought from his father, who had assumed the relationship was permanent. They didn't blame me, he said. They understood, but they didn't come back.
That story, the dealer who had to choose and the customers who left quietly and did not return, repeated itself across the Corn Belt throughout the late 1960s and into the 1970s. It is not a dramatic story. There was no confrontation, no announcement, no ceremony. There was simply a morning when the lot had fewer Prairie Gold machines on it than it had the year before, and then a morning when there were none, and then a year when the sign came down and the building became something else. In Litchfield, Minnesota, the former Minneapolis-Moline dealership on Sibley Avenue North is today a tire and auto parts retailer. The building is the same. The service bay doors are the same. The overhead crane that once lifted tractor engines out of their frames for overhaul is still bolted to the ceiling, though it has not moved in 20 years. The man who runs the tire business knows what the building used to be. He has found, on 3 separate occasions while doing renovation work, old Minneapolis-Moline parts order forms tucked into the walls. The paper kind, carbon copied in triplicate, with part numbers and customer names written in pencil. He keeps them in a folder. He is not sure why exactly, except that they seem to belong to the building.
To understand what the disappearance of Minneapolis-Moline meant to the farms that ran their machines, you have to understand what was happening to those farms at the same moment. The 1970s and 1980s were not simply a period of agricultural economic stress. They were the period in which the generational transfer of the American family farm, the passage from father to son that had defined rural land tenure since the Homestead Act, began to break down in a systematic way.
A farmer who had built a 640-acre operation in Renville County through the 1950s and 60s, running Minneapolis-Moline equipment bought new from the Olivia dealer, had reasonable grounds in 1972 to believe that his son would farm that same ground. The son had grown up on it. He knew the fields. He knew the drainage tiles and the low corners and the wet spring that came every third year and held up planting by 2 weeks. He knew the G1000 in the shed the way he knew his own hands.
What he did not know, and what no one told him clearly enough in time, was that the land values inflating around him through the mid-1970s, driven by grain export booms and the Earl Butz doctrine of plant fence row to fence row, were building a debt structure that the commodity prices of the 1980s would not support. When corn fell and interest rates rose, and the banker in town stopped extending credit on ground that was now worth half what it had been appraised at 3 years earlier, the son who had planned to farm his father's land found himself inheriting not a farm, but a foreclosure. Some of those sons left. They went to the cities, to Minneapolis, to Sioux Falls, to Omaha, and they did not come back, not to farm. Some of their fathers left too, in the particular way that older men leave things that have broken their hearts, quietly, without making a production of it, taking only what fit in a truck and leaving the rest. What remained in those sheds, in many cases, was the equipment. A G1000 does not sell well in a distress auction when the commodity economy has collapsed and no one is buying large acreage equipment at any price. It stays. It sits in the shed for a year, and then 5 years. And then someone comes along who has scraped together enough to buy the ground at the reduced price, and they open the shed, and the tractor is there. Prairie Gold, under 30 years of dust. They check the oil. They put fresh fuel in the tank. Sometimes it starts.
There is one more thing to be said about Minneapolis-Moline that the standard history of fallen brands does not capture, and it has to do with the people who worked in the Hopkins engineering department in the years when the company was being absorbed and diluted and rebranded into something that no longer had a clear reason to exist. These were engineers who had spent their careers trying to solve real problems for real farmers. The UDLX enclosed cab of 1938 was their most visible idea, but it was not their only one. Minneapolis-Moline introduced the LP gas tractor in the late 1940s, at a time when liquid petroleum offered a real economic alternative to gasoline for farmers who could produce or purchase it locally. They developed a diesel conversion for their existing gas engines years before most competitors had committed to diesel as the primary fuel for row crop tractors. They built a torque amplifier transmission system, the AmpliTorque, that gave operators a 2-range on-the-go gear split without clutching, a convenience that would not become standard across the industry for another decade. These ideas did not fail because they were wrong. They were right. They simply belonged to a company that was running out of time to be right in.
The engineers who developed those systems did not, for the most part, disappear when the brand did. They went to John Deere, to Case, to International Harvester, to the companies that had survived by being larger and better capitalized, and that were now quietly benefiting from the knowledge that had been developed on the floors of the Hopkins plant and in the engineering offices above it. The ideas migrated. The brand did not. That is perhaps the final measure of what Minneapolis-Moline contributed to American agriculture. Not just the tractors it built, but the tractors it made possible. The enclosed cabs, the diesel conversions, the transmission refinements that appeared on other manufacturers' machines in the years after Hopkins went quiet, attributed to no one in particular, remembered by the men who had first drawn them on drafting tables in Minnesota, and who knew exactly where those ideas had come from.
The Minneapolis-Moline story is not an isolated one. It is one chapter in a longer account of what happened to the middle tier of American agricultural manufacturing in the second half of the 20th century. The companies too large to survive as specialists, too small to survive as giants, caught between a consolidating industry and a consolidating farm sector that were both moving in the same direction at the same time, toward fewer units, larger scale, and less room for the names that had built the business in the first place. If that story matters to you, and if you are watching this, it probably does, then the next chapter is waiting. The meadow green of an Oliver tractor, the factory in Charles City, Iowa, where Hart Parr built the first successful American gasoline tractor in 1901, and what that town looks like today. If your family ran Oliver Iron, or if you have ever wondered what becomes of a factory town when the factory decides it is done, that is the story we will tell next. If you grew up on one of these machines, or if your father did, or his father before him, leave that in the comments. This channel exists because of the people who remember, and there are more of you than the algorithm knows.